So this is going to be part 3 of our putting it all together, and this video is going to talk about middleware, middleware. In our Node Express we have something called, well, in Node, not Express, we have something called middleware. And what it is middleware allows us to bring in other modules in our application, similar to what we saw with Express. And there's a bunch of different modules that we can bring in to allow us to do our work. Now, we're just barely going to scratch the surface of middleware, and the only reason we're going to talk about it is because there's actually different modules that we want to bring in to our Node Express application that we're going to make. Those different modules that we want to bring in are the following. We've already brought in Express. We want to bring in body parser, Knex, SQLite 3, and EJS. The way we do this is by going to our terminal window and using our Node Package Manager. npm install body parser. Now, as stated, body parser is part of Express, but I am showing you this in case you see this in other Node Express applications that you might be maintaining. We install body parser, and it goes through and brings it up and installs it into your project. What body parser does for us is it allows us to take the request from the HTTP. Do you remember right up here we said we have a request and a response? It allows us to take the request and parse the data out of it. So it's going to cut down on the amount of work we have to do to pull data out of the actual request. Someone already wrote that code for us. We're happy with what they did, and so we can just bring it in and use it. Another module that we want to install, npm install, will be called Knex. And so go ahead and type in npm install Knex, and that will install this into our system. And what this does for us is it brings in a module that allows us to do SQL query building with different databases. And what it does is it makes it simpler for us to connect to a database and then actually use that database in our code. And you can see right here, I'll scroll down, that installed correctly. So body parser takes the request and allows us to pull data out of the request from the client, meaning if we had an HTML form, we send that data to the server. Body parser allows us to extract the data out of that form, out of the request of the form. Knex allows us to interface with a database and make life simpler for connecting to it and querying the database, pulling data out. Another one that we want to install and use is SQLite 3. But remember, you have to npm it, install SQLite 3. And SQLite 3 is a scaled down version of Microsoft SQL, which allows us to have a database in our website. These are all free, by the way, which is why we like them. So this is now installed SQLite 3. So now we have Knex, which allows us to connect to a database, and SQLite 3, which allows us to create and work with the database. And the last one I want you to install is called EJS. Now, what EJS will do for us in Node Express is it stands for Embedded JavaScript, and this is a way that we can embed JavaScript inside of our HTML code, and we use a special character for marking up. So go ahead and install that one. And once they're installed, I want you to look at your package.json, not the lock, but package. We'll go ahead and close this shell. And if you look, what it's done is it said, hey, we have the following dependencies that our package needs. Body parser, EJS, Express, Knex, and SQLite. And this is a way that we can bring in modules into our program so that we can actually use them in our website. I'm going to go ahead and close the package.json because I don't want to take a chance messing with it. And I'll close those HTML files that we've created. So now we're back to our index.js file. Now if we want to start using those modules, then we have to require them just like we did with Express and Path. I'm going to go ahead and change that to double quotes so I can be consistent. It doesn't really matter, but probably OCD about it. Okay, I want to create a variable. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a variable. I'm going to call it port, and it's equal to 3000. Now this has nothing to do with the Express, but one thing I can do is use that variable, and right here I can type in that variable instead of the number. That way I just have to change it in one spot if I had it in more than one place. Next thing I want you to do is I want you to create a body parser variable. Let, and we'll just call it body parser equals, and remember if you want to use the module you have to require it. Require body dash parser. Now also remember I said that body parser is included in Express. So I'm just showing you what would happen if you saw older versions of body parser that maybe it was already included. Then I would not have to have this statement right here. I'm going to come up here and comment these so that you can remember what they do. This gives access to the Express library. This creates an Express application object. This gives access to the path. We use this variable for our port communication, and this gives access to the body parser library used in the request. Extracting, I'll continue it, data from the request. In other words, the form. Okay? Next thing we need to do is I want to be able to connect to a database. So we're going to create another variable. Var connect equals require connect. This gives access to Knex, which provides SQL, structured query language, in our app. And so if you notice, when you bring in those modules, you have to create variables for them. Now hold on to this thought. We're not done with Knex right now, but I want to do the following. I want to go have you create a database table. So what I need you to do, if you haven't already done this already, you're going to download and install DB Browser. We should have done that on a previous video. Let's go ahead and go to DB Browser. And so remember, DB Browser for SQLite is a way that we can create databases. I want to create a brand new database, and we want to make sure that we put our database in the same file where we're putting all of our web stuff. So mine is users prof greg and whole project is where we're going to store that, and we're going to call our database student and click save. Actually, instead of student, let's call it registration. and click Save. Now let's create a table. We'll call the table Student, and we want to add some fields to this table. Let's add a field. The first one will be called Student ID. That's going to be an integer, not null. Whoops, sorry, I clicked on that. Integer, not null, primary key, and an auto increment. Another field will be first name. That's going to be text, not null. Another one will be last name. That will be text, not null. And then the last field we're going to add is going to be called email, and that will be text, and it can be null if we want. Now that we've typed in the table name and the table structure, click OK, and that creates our table. Click on Browse Data and click on New Record. Notice the auto-incremented field automatically incremented. If you don't know how to do this, go back and watch the video on installing DB Browser. First name will be Buck, the last name will be Wheat, and the email will be buckwheat@rascal.com. New record, Mary Lamb. We'll say Mary doesn't have an email right now. Then click on Write Changes so that it flushes the buffer and stores all the data. We now have a database called registration with the table called student and 2 records in it. You don't have to have records, but we're going to start with some. Go ahead and close DB Browser and come back to your index.js page. Now inside of our index.js page, we want our connect variable to connect with that database. So here's how you do that. Take off that semicolon, and what we want to do is put in a parenthesis, curly brace. So do you see that we now have a parenthesis curly brace here? And we're going to start specifying attributes. The first attribute we want to specify will be called client, and we want the client to be our SQLite 3 database structure. Now make sure you spell SQLite correctly. There's only one L. The next attribute we want to create will be the connection object. Since it's an object, we do a curly brace. And in that connection object, we want to specify the file name. And the file name is going to be /, meaning go to our root directory of our folder that we're working in, and the name of that database, which was registration.db, comma, because we have another attribute. The last attribute we want to specify is called use null as default, and we want to specify that to have a true value. What that actually means is that on some of our columns, which could be keys, and we've said we require them, if those keys don't have values, we'll go ahead and replace the value with null rather than whatever the default could be. So that's what the use null as default. And when I was working on this, I had to supply that or I got an error message. So now we've set up our connect object, which talks to our database, which is a SQLite 3 database. Now that we have all those objects set up, what we want to do is continue writing our application to where we can display the data from that database on a web page. Well, the first thing that we need to do after that then is we actually need to use body parser. And here's how we do it. app.use the body parser object that we created. And there's a method called URL encoded. And what this is telling us to do in the URL encoded is that it will take that data that we get and turn it into like a rich format, like a JSON experience, where it's like objects and arrays. And so it's a way of telling the system we want it to organize that data in an easier way for us to work with. And so you say URL encoded, parenthesis, curly brace, extended, colon, true. Make sure you put a semicolon at the end. So once again, what this is doing for us is it actually says it allows us to use objects, sorry about the typos, objects and arrays like JSON format. And you'll see this when we start working with the data. So it's a lot easier on how it organizes the data from the requests that we're going to work with. So that actually sets up our database and how we're going to work with the data. Now, the other thing we need to do is we included what we called EJS. And what EJS does for us, embedded JavaScript templating, is it allows us to embed JavaScript inside of the HTML through markups. Sort of like your markup tags in HTML, but we can now embed plain JavaScript inside of our HTML tags, meaning we're going to have complete power over what an HTML page actually does for us. And we'll see this being used. One of the most important things EJS will do for us is it will allow us to pull data out of our database through our response and send it back to our browser through the HTML page and then process that data. By the way, I want to back up just a little bit and explain something a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit cleaner since I put comments in there. And what I want you to realize once again is that here we said we wanted to use body parser. And in order to use body parser, I said we needed to create a body parser object and require the module. And then down here, in order to use body parser, I said app.use body parser. Well, and take note of this, I already said that body parser was included in Express. So I really don't have to do that if you don't want to. But if you don't do it the old way, then you would have to use a statement like this. And both of them are fine. They both work. Would say app.use, and we would use the express object and say URL encoded, and we would just paste in that same thing. That would do the same thing that the previous line did, and going that route means we do not have to bring in a body parser object. So just be aware that's another way that we could do the body parser. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the old school way by creating a body parser app, but I'll leave that others commented. In fact, let me put a note right here that says if you want to use the new way, then comment out the next line. Okay, so this is new way, and then new way would comment that out. So make sure you understand that. It is included. You don't have to bring body parser in. I just wanted you to practice bringing modules in, and you might see this being used in code that you have to maintain. All right, so let's get back to what EJS is going to do for us then. Now that we've got our library or our Connect library set up to work with the database and the table, now that we said that we want it to pull back our data looking really cool like JSON format with objects and arrays, now what we want to do is we need to say we want to use EJS as our view engine. Now, what does that actually mean if I talk about a view engine? A view engine specifies how do you look at your HTML pages? There are a variety of different view engines that are out there. For instance, there was one called Jade, J-A-D-E, which they now call Pug, P-U-G. In other languages like ASP.NET, we have the Razor view engine. And so what these view engines do for you is they translate our view, what the user sees, into HTML and then renders them to the browser so that the user can see them on their computers when they go to our web pages. And so that's what a view engine will actually do for us. It takes whatever we type, turns it into HTML, and then makes sure the browser knows how to display them, or turns them into the necessary code for the browser to display. We're using the EJS view, but we actually have to tell our system we want EJS as our view rather than just straight HTML. So here's how we do that. You do the following. You say app.set view engine, and then we specify the type of view engine we want to work with. We want to work with EJS. So this specifies how we want our HTML code to work with in the browser. In other words, we're going to write pages. We're going to write EJS pages rather than HTML. And then our view engine turns that EJS page into an HTML page and helps the browser draw it on the screen for the client. You'll see this in action a little bit later. So now that we have our Express set up, our path created, our port specified, our Express object also created, the body parser module brought in, our connect object so that we can work with SQLite and our database, our body parser for how we're going to extract the data out of the request, and what view we're going to use for writing our web pages and converting our web pages. We can actually start writing the web pages. Now, since we're using the Vue Express engine, you're actually going to have to write EJS files. So let's go write our first EJS file. Go ahead and create a new file, and I want you to call it file save as. I want you to call it index.ejs. Notice you're not saying HTML, you're saying EJS. Save. So in this index.ejs file, just type in I am in the index.ejs and save that. I want you to come over to here and get rid of, right mouse click on About HTML, delete that. Right mouse click on Email Page, delete that. And then be careful on this, but right mouse click on index.html and delete that. So the only thing you see now is your index.ejs and your index.js and your package.json and your database, along with this nose module. Okay, I want you to go ahead and go to the terminal. Make sure you save often. I want you to run node.js. And if I try to run it now, it says it's listening. But what's going to happen if I come back over and try to run that local host? Let's see what happens. We try to run localhost and it says, hey, I don't know where the index file is anymore, because I'm trying to go to a folder called views under whole project under this directory path. And that's because since we did the following, we'll come back over here and stop this, go back to index.js. Since we said that our view engine is going to be EJS, it's trying to find a subfolder here called views. Now what I've seen is sometimes when I work with this, a views folder automatically gets created for you when you work with EJS. Sometimes it doesn't. If you do not see a views folder, I want you to right mouse click on whole project, choose new folder, and type in views. Press enter. And then I want you to drag index.js into that views folder. Yes, move it. So that's where the index.js file is now. It's in the views folder. Make sure you understand that. Since we set our view engine to be EJS, it's no longer going to look in the root directory for HTML files. It's only going to look for EJS files now. Even if we say we want to work with index, it's looking for EJS. And those EJS files have to be under the views subfolder. Let's come back over to our index.js, and right here where we're saying go find that index file, we're sending a file. Instead of doing a send file, I want to do the following. We're still going to use our response, but instead of doing a send file, I want to use render. And then you're going to specify what you want to render. We want to render the index file. Now remember, it's not going to look for index.html, it's going to look for index.ejs under the views subfolder. Let's save that one more time. Go back out to the terminal, start our node project, go back to the browser, type in localhost, and it says I am in the index.ejs file. So that's quite exciting, because now, Control C, close, instead of using our HTML files, we're going to be using EJS files. Well, what can we do with an EJS file? Let's do the following. Come back to our EJS file, and let's type in some HTML code. Let's do our doc type HTML, and let's do our HTML tag, and we're going to do our closing HTML tag. And if you notice, the system isn't helping me anymore. Visual Studio is not helping me doing my coding and closing off tags. So let's go ahead and finish off our HTML file. We'll have our head, we'll have our body, and then let's do the following. Let's go ahead and we'll just bring in a style sheet and a title. And so in our head, I'm going to put a title, and we'll call this, well, I did put pivotal search, we'll just put a sample web. That'll be good for us. And then we also want to bring a link to a style sheet. Oh, whoops, I'm not putting that in the head. My typos. Make sure that goes inside of your head tag. So now we got a style sheet coming in, we have a title in there, and let's go ahead and do the following. In the actual body, we want to put the following code. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste in some code, and then I'm going to explain what the code means. So let me put this code in here, and we'll make it look nice, and then we're going to go through and make sure you understand this also. So let's understand what we're doing here. So the first thing is I want you to see the code that I put in. And so you might not have been able to see this whole link. Let me try to drop that down, make it a little more readable for you so you can see that. Just bringing in some CSS that's out there to make our table look a little better. So we created our doc type, our HTML, our head. We have a title, our link to a CSS page, closing of the head. We created a body. We then said let's make a table, class table, so that we can implement probably our CSS that we have out there. In that table, we're going to break it into a table heading, and we're going to break it into a table body. There's an opening and closing table body tag. In the table heading, we're going to create a table row, and in that table row, we're going to put 4 table headings: student ID, first name, last name, and receive email. So we now have a table row with the headings. It'll look something like student ID, first name, last name, and receive email. We just created a row that looks like that in our web page. That's what that table row with our table headings does, and it only makes one of them. Then we come into the body, and in the body what we want to do is we want to use some data from our database, and we want to get that data from our index.js file. So we can actually use EJS. Now this is EJS. When you see that less than % sign, that's EJS. And when we have a less than greater than sign, that's actually called control flow. We're controlling the flow of the HTML using this EJS, and it allows us to embed JavaScript inside of our HTML. And we're now saying we want to do a for loop. And in this for loop, we probably want to pull off all the records from the database table that we want to work with. So let's hold on to this thought, and let's come back over to our index.js file. In our index.js file, we set up our connect, our body parser, our view engine. You already went and created a subfolder called views. Don't forget to make a subfolder. And you created a file called index.ejs, right? And that's the file we were modifying. What we want to do is we want to modify our get for that index.ejs. And remember, if we say slash, that says go to the root directory, which is the index.html, but we're not using index.html, we're using EJS. So we'll try to find index.ejs. I'm going to close this so you can see all of this. And what it now does, what we're going to say for it to do, is the following. Go ahead and receive some function that has a request and a response. And by the way, if you don't want to write it that way, you don't have to. You could do what they call an arrow function. And an arrow function says you don't say the word function anymore, but you just say parenthesis req res equal greater than. That's the same as saying function. We just replace the word function and put an equal greater than. They call it an arrow function. And so we say for this arrow function, we want to work with the connect object and run the following SQL select statement. We want to pull off the student ID, the first name, the last name, and the email. So that's your select. That's as if you had typed select student ID, comma, first, well, it's trying to help me, isn't it? Student ID, comma, see if I can get around that. There we go. Comma, and first name, comma, and last name, comma, and email. It's building that statement. I'll delete that in just a minute. From what table do you want to work with? From the student table. And remember, we can access the student table because up here we said go work with the registration database, and that's where the student table lives. From the student table, and then order by student ID. That's what this is building for us. It's building that SQL select statement. Let me go ahead and get rid of that. Come back to here. Now the next thing, and I just tabbed over, the next thing it's doing then is after we do the order by, we're saying once you have done that select statement, then I want you to pass the results to a variable called student. So that whole select statement data goes into the variable called student. And we're going to send that variable student to this, whatever this is. We're saying go to our response, render an EJS web page, render the index.js web page, send a parameter called test, and pass it the student data that I just populated with that select statement. So all the records go into that variable, and we send that variable to the EJS page to a variable called test. That now gets sent to our index.js page, and here it says, and if you have a problem, then I want you to display that problem to the console and send the response of a status 500, which is an error message. And those are your standard error messages like not found, or there's a problem here, or Houston, we have a problem, or danger, Will Robinson. And so this allows us to display that we have a problem. So let's see what this code is doing then. It's saying to the response, send the results of the select statement to that variable, pass that variable as that variable to the index.js page. You might have to scroll the screen back and forth to make sure that you have that. So let's save that. Now let's go back to your index.js, and I think this is going to make more sense. So back in our index.js file, we said in the body, execute EJS and embed JavaScript. We said that for the variable starting at I equals 0, as long as I is less than test.length. Now do you remember what test is? Test holds the data from student that we passed to index. So in other words, it holds the records from the table student we grabbed using the select connect. So this says as long as our counter is less than the record numbers, how many records we're pulling back, then we want to do a loop. Now this might be a little confusing to you because you see that it closes off the EJS. Well, it has to close off the EJS because it's going to start writing HTML. And since it writes HTML, we have to say, well, it's not EJS. So that's why we close off that curly brace. But you're going to see later on, we're not done yet with the curly brace. So in the for loop, we say create a brand new row, create a brand new column. In the first column, we want to go ahead and do the following. In fact, we're going to keep this more simple. Let's just get rid of this first column. Let's clean it up a little bit. We just want to display data. So we're just going to display data. Come back to here. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. We want to display data, and we want to add one more column to that row. And the column we're going to add to that row is going to be the student ID. So let's see if this makes more sense. Here's our for loop, JavaScript. Create a row, create a new column, EJS again. Now in this case, we said less than % equals. This means we're bringing output, or we're grabbing output. We're sending output. And the output is going to be from our database. So that's why we're using the less than % equal sign. we're saying go to test. Remember what test was? It was a collection of all of our rows from the database tables. And so we say go to the first record in that array of records and pull off the student ID for the first column. Make another new column, EJS. Go to the first record and grab the first name for that column. New column. Go to the first record, grab the last name. New column. Go to the first record and grab the email. And then we close off the for loop. That's what this is doing right here. This closes off that for loop right there. So what this will do is for every record in that database that we grabbed back over in here with our Knex select, we're going to create a brand new row and we're going to display each of those columns in that row. Let's save this, see what errors we have. Here's what we do. Go to terminal. Make sure you start node. Let's go back to our web page. And let's do a local host. And look at that. It's pulling off all of our data that we have. Remember we made 2 records? Under the one student column, it displays the ID for the first record, Buck, Wheat, and the email. For the second record, to Mary and Lamb. And then it says, oh, I don't have any more records. I'm done. And this is a way, using EJS, that you can embed JavaScript inside of your HTML and work with database that is passed to this spreadsheet, to this HTML form. How did we do it again? Because over here we said, if they ever go to the root directory, execute this select statement and send the data that we collected to a variable called test in index.js. What if I called this something else? What if I called this pancakes? Okay? And if I tried to run it one more time, let's see what happens. I save that, go to new terminal, node is running, go back to our browser, let's just refresh it, and it says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Test is not defined. Okay, so let's go back to here, go back to Node Express, and instead of using the word test, what did we call it over here? We called it pancake. Pancake.length. Pancake, 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 pancake. Why pancake? I don't know. I'm probably hungry. Let's come back over to here. Node, run node. Come back to this tab. Run the local one more time. And now it shows. So can you see that what's happening is that whatever we call this variable right here and what we pass it, we have to make sure that matches. Could I call this student even though I called this student right here? I don't know. Let's try it. Come back over to our EJS, and right here, let's say the word student. We'll save that. Go back to the terminal. Run the node one more time. Go back to our browser. Refresh. And it works great. So we can do that too, which might make it less complicated. So just understand that what you have to do then is in your JS, we use our connect to grab our data. Our data says run that SQL statement and pass the results of it to some variable. We called it student. I could have called it anything. We then said pass the results of that variable to a parameter called student in the index.js file. Over in the index.js file, I can now use that array of records, which is the result from the select statement. And for each record, I can pull off the column names and display them using EJS to create the columns and using a for loop. So EJS allows us to embed JavaScript, which allows us to grab data.